This is episode 38 of the Arts Academy podcast with Victor Varnado and Roxxy Haze. How to structure a podcast with special guest Kazeem Rahman.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Arts Academy podcast, brought to you by the New York Alt Art Academy. We teach you everything about entertainment and the arts that we possibly can. Glad to have you. I am Dean Victor Varnado, and this is Deputy Headmistress Roxxy Haze. Here she is. And Professor Kazeem
I did add.
Rahman.
I added Professor at the last minute. I'm sorry.
You added Professor. Well, you know, that's fine. I can't say that you're going to be accredited by the
Oh, no.
but I mean, we're glad to have you here as a guest speaker.
For having me.
All right, so let's get started, everybody. Hello, and thanks for being out there. Big hello to Wanda. How you doing? And also, Muhammad, thank you for hanging out. Today, we're going to talk about how to design a podcast. And before we get into it, let me just tell you that sometimes people will hire me to help them design programming, whether it be television or also podcasts. And so what I've done is I've really worked down like the things that I believe should be part of a what quote unquote prestige podcast. Now, there's really no categorization for prestige podcast, but I'm calling a prestige podcast a podcast that has a very specific structure and or personality. Because as I was talking before, a lot of podcasts, the structure is mostly two people having a conversation. But there's all kinds of different ways that podcasts can be put together. And so we're going to talk about that. And then I'm going to talk you through what a design sheet for a podcast actually looks like. And then that will be the end of this particular class. All right. So let's get started. Okay. So now when you are about to start doing a podcast, recognize like the format. There's a lot of different formats that podcasts can go by. The number one, of course, is the interview format, which tons and tons of podcasts are. Not only that, that is also usually part of most every single kind of podcast and interview somewhere. Then, of course, there's a format which a lot of people call a gab fest. They call them gab fest. There's another name that I wrote down, the Chumcast. Have you heard those?
No.
Okay, so a gab fest or Chumcast is usually where it's an interview podcast, but the interview is usually about something very, very specific that the people who run the podcast are fond of. Like it could be a whole podcast that's always about Rubik's Cubes, period, and that's it. There, like my dad wrote a porno is definitely an example where it's very specific about this one thing that they're doing in the podcast. Then storytelling podcasts are also huge. If you remember Serial, that's definitely a storytelling podcast. Also investigative journalism. Then there's, of course, a game show. Those are my favorite podcast format is a game show. Love a good game show. My personal podcast is a game show podcast. And then, of course, there's like documentary journalism, just every type of format you can think of. Those exist in the podcast world. I think a lot of people don't necessarily think about all the different genres a podcast can be unless you're really into podcasting. But I think people who are just casually thinking about starting a podcast, they think interview. They think, oh, I'll do a Joe Rogan show and that's it. And so, but there's a lot of different ways you can go. And then once you are, oh, by the way, I'm sorry, Kazeem, honored visiting professor. What?
Adjunct.
Adjunct professor. Honored visiting adjunct. Well, a visiting professor is not an adjunct professor.
Is it not? Well, that's what I've been putting on the stuff.
It's a guest. Technically, it's a guest lecturer.
But I like how adjunct sounds.
A guest lecturer. And so, yeah, because an adjunct professor is not actually a professor.
You're gonna keep coming, right?
What?
Just let me have it. just
Why?
like how
You can
I just
have
like
it.
how
Why?
I just like how it looks on the stuff.
It's not. No, I told Roxy, I said
Nice.
straight up, it sounded so fancy.
It sounded fancy.
Even though technically that's not what I am for this.
Fancy over technically correct.
Right. I am an adjunct professor, so that is not impressive. All right. So what? I am. I'm an adjunct professor. Look at me. I like poop and farts. All right. And then but I wanted to say, Kazeem, if you wanted to chime in on any of this, please feel free. Same for you, Deputy Headmistress over there, Roxxy Haze.
I just realized mine's a hybrid of two of the ones you said.
One thing to chime in on what you said is that true crime is also a category that's actually the most popular category. Like my favorite murder or anything that's to deal with true crime. Serial technically is like a true crime thing, but it's more of a storytelling kind of thing. True crime is like this murder we're going to talk about today, and then the next episode is this other murder we're going to talk about.
Oh, as a matter of fact, I was going to talk about true crime a little bit, but I was actually categorizing that as a genre. So like a podcast can have a format and then a genre, and then so like whereas serial is a storytelling true crime, and then my favorite murder is an investigative true crime. So, but I was gonna talk about that too. But true crime is definitely, and that's actually where we're going to next. We're going to talk about genres very quickly, just like any book or movie or comic book. A podcast can of course be any sort of genre, whether it is actual fiction or autobiographical. One of my favorite kind of podcasts is where they just play games on the podcast. I love like a good Dungeons and Dragons podcast, especially with some sound design. So happy. But I actually just got a list of genres, and I'm going to read a few off to you. Maybe there's some in here that you probably haven't thought of. For instance, history, news and politics, educational, personal journals, religious, interview cast, which is really the interview format, audio dramas, environmental science, sports, technology, comedy cast, crime, society and culture, kids and families, health, pop culture, advice and self-help, philosophy, business, games and hobbies. After you've picked your format and then you've picked your genre, the next thing you're probably going to start focusing on is what is the structure of your podcast going to be. Now, first of all, I'm going to talk about the most common podcast structure out there. And then after that, I'll talk about how I would work with someone to design their podcast. So here's the most common structure of a podcast that is out there. Like I would say 80% of podcasts have this structure. Okay, usually a podcast will open with a tease, some sort of tease of information that is going to happen within the podcast. Sometimes people do it by verbally saying, thanks for coming to the podcast. Coming up today, XYZ happens. Or sometimes they'll do an audio clip of something that some high point of action or interest that happens in the podcast. Usually this is no more than 10 seconds. Then a lot of podcasts have opening titles or opening themes that they will play. Then often is an overview where the podcast will start and they'll catch the audience up on exactly what's happening or what's going on in their lives or what to expect that day during the podcast, or also maybe even talk about why they decided to cover the subject they're covering that day. Just usually some sort of overview that kind of like hits the reset button, gets everybody to hear whatever it is they're about to hear. Then the main section of the podcast happens. Now, this is where a lot of podcasts vary. If your main section is just a straight up interview, often it'll be a straight up interview. If your main section is a series of pre-recorded, highly edited pieces that tell a broader story, then that's when these sections begin. Sometimes if you do have specific sections, there are transitions between sections that people will build into the podcast. But basically after the overview, the podcast goes into the main meat of the podcast. Then at the end, usually there's some sort of closing remark, like thank you, thank you, we learned this, or thank you, this podcast has always been about XYZ, and then usually a call to action at the very end of the podcast, usually like, if you want to know more about this, look up the Red Cross or subscribe to our podcast or check us out here or there. Just telling the audience something that they should do so that they can I don't know, be your puppets. No, just something that they can do. Not be your puppet, but
oh my God.
But usually there is a call to action.
Join your podcast community. There we go.
Yeah, join your podcast community. All right, so that's the most popular structure of podcasts from my own research. Do you have anything different?
I would say that's the general thing. I would say that most podcasts don't do, I would say the more edited podcasts do like this snippet of the podcast up top.
Right.
I've noticed that. I don't do that because I'm just lazy. So mine is just music, and then I start the podcast, right? And then in the beginning, I say, "Hey, I'm me. Here's my guest. We have like maybe 2 seconds of pleasantries. How are you?" And then we just go ahead and start. I'm
gonna talk you through a podcast. Now, this is actually a podcast that I pitched to some people, but I wasn't prepared to do this as a podcast without a budget to pay people because it was a highly edited podcast, just like you're talking about, Kazeem. So when I couldn't get the right people to pay me the right amount of money to do this particular podcast, I actually changed what I did as a podcast, and that became the podcast that I'm doing right now, which is Six Unseemly Question. But this podcast, which is called Lesson Learned, I'm actually, for those of you who are watching this as a video live, you're going to see this come up on the screen. But if you're not, we will talk through everything. Okay, so now what I'm going through right now is what is called a design doc. Design docs can have, I think, two major functions. Number one, it's a way to get everybody on the same page about what the podcast is going to be, especially when a podcast is going to require money. Like if it's going to require money, you need to be able to clearly tell people what you need that money for. And then also it's a type of thing that you would pass on to an editor. Another thing a design doc can do is just be a pitch document, so that when you are trying to pitch to people to actually maybe make it part of their network or write those checks, then a pitch document will serve you rather well. Okay, so in this pitch document for Lesson Learned is actually just 2 pages. You can have really long pitch documents, and actually normally this is more like the raw pitch document. Normally what I would do is I would also make this a very pleasant to look at PowerPoint sort of thing, but the information would be the same, even though it would look like a child's picture book. All right, so what I start with usually is I start with the name of the project, contact information at the top. Then even in a page that is bland, like the one that some of you are looking at right now, I will usually put a picture at the top just to give people a sort of the mood. So the podcast is called Lesson Learned. And I'm not going to read this verbatim, but I will tell you that, first of all, we try to whet people's appetites. So the first thing that we throw up there are the credits of the host of the podcast. Even though we're not big celebrities, we at least like to let people know that we have a little bit of a following. Next, I talk about, I do a quick synopsis of the podcast in the podcast personality or voice. In this case, we basically say it's a weekly psychological and philosophical game show where we judge people we hear stories from people, and then they try to judge what those people are like. And then at the end, we just throw out jokes instead of learning something from it. Then I give an overview, which is more specific with less personality, but more specific about what happens in the podcast. Now, since this was a pitch document, I actually went ahead and I had recorded pilot versions of the podcast. So in this particular pitch document, once I say what the podcast is, then I immediately delve into here's an example of the podcast. Now, you won't always have this if you've got a podcast. Sometimes you won't have recorded episodes, but if you do have recorded episodes, you want to get to them as quickly as possible because people want to read as little as possible. So the quicker you can dive into media, if you have it, the better. Just set them up and then be ready to go. So then I've talked about the podcast, and I talked about that we listen to people's stories. Then I give examples of what episodes would be like on paper. In this particular document, we call it story samples, and then we give brief overviews of what type of stories a podcast might cover. Then I go to an episode breakdown. An episode breakdown for a podcast will usually delineate in a highly produced podcast. It'll delineate what each section is and what each section feels like. Sometimes it'll take it down to the point of, say, each section will last this many minutes or seconds. But it really is just like one after another. I like what I was talking about earlier, like this exists, like it lists a cold open, it lists an opening theme, it lists the intro, it lists a part of the podcast which we call the personality test, it lists pre-game trivia, the best guess story segments. And now that we've talked through a little bit about how that works, I just want to move on to at the end of this. I usually at the end, I usually say some sort of like joke in the style of the podcast that I'm pitching to just kind of catch the audience that I'm pitching to at the end of the document. I didn't do it here. I'm sure I did it, but I just don't think it was in this particular document I'm showing you. I feel like, and I don't know if you feel like this too, Kazeem, but I feel like that it's definitely difficult to plan something like a podcast that is like really highly produced when you probably haven't done a podcast before. And so I feel like you said yourself, like when you did your podcast, you added things to the podcast as you began, and at the very beginning you made it simple
as possible. So for if we go back to that pitch statement, for anyone that's actually trying to do like their own podcast that doesn't have like a studio, that pitch statement is actually a good blueprint of like what to do for yourself. If you have an idea, to just write it down. Just say, this is what I want the podcast to be about. I want to have an intro music. I want to introduce this person. I want to have like this, segment for like, we're going to talk about this and stuff like that. That if I had one of those, that would have made the first 20 episodes that were garbage way better than
it does help with clarity. Like,
yeah,
if you do write it down, and I know writing things down sounds like it sucks. Who wants to do that? It's homework, but it really, really does help if you just take the time to write it down. And even if you've never written one before, just write down your best version. Write it down as if you had to communicate it succinctly to somebody else. Then you'll have a document which is going to help you make your show.
And it doesn't, like you said, it doesn't even have to be formatted. You can literally just write a paragraph. I want my podcast to be about this. I want to talk about this. These are other things I want to talk about, right? And then you can just start doing it.
To reiterate something that we were talking about before, now the reason that this podcast didn't go forward was because I knew that if I was going to do a podcast for free and not have somebody pay me to do the podcast, I knew that I wasn't going to put in the amount of work it took to produce one of these episodes. We didn't actually get to it, but then like we have interviews from people telling the stories that we cut in, and there's a lot more game show segments, and there's research because I actually asked trivia questions based on the they answer trivia questions based on the theme of what was going on the podcast, and it's really fun to listen to. But I also knew that I wasn't going to produce that for free.
But could you make?
Sorry, go on.
But could you make the argument that it was more of an idea that you weren't like? It wasn't an idea that you weren't completely like passionate about, or was it like, oh, this is just too much to do?
Oh no, I mean, no, that's actually even I'm completely passionate about it. I mean, I was in fact most things that I pitch to people that are my creations, I'm very, very passionate about. However, it doesn't mean that I'll spend 8 hours a week working on them for free. I'm passionate about it, but
about that bread.
I'm passionate about it, but I also know that my time is also worth something to me personally. And the thing is, am I going to spend 8 hours a week on a podcast that's going to make $0? No. But I created a podcast that I could spend less time on, that is now moving into making money on its own, because it was a podcast that I could sustain over time, knowing that I was only going to commit X amount of hours a week. So now my current podcast is starting
perfect. That was
bigger.
the gold nugget of just making sure that the amount of production has to equal the amount of available time that you have.
Absolutely. That would be the number one thing that's probably one of the most often used pieces of advice that I have, because people often will come to me and say, hey, Victor, I want to do this idea. What do you think? And usually it's so convoluted and crazy. I'm like, this can't be a series that you produce on your own unless you just want to never do anything else. Like, make something that you can do. Like, think about what your resources are. The amount of time is a resource. Money is a resource. For me now, like, I actually have a lot of productions going on at once for a single person, but that's because my resources have grown, because I measured what my resources were as I started. I didn't try to jump into having, like, what do I have now? Like 2 podcasts and a live show, and also a production company. Like, I didn't jump in doing that. I started very slowly. Yeah. All right. Anyway, that is about it for how to structure a podcast. I hope everybody out there found something that they can use. Do you have any questions? If people have questions, you should throw them in the comments right now. But if you don't have questions, I'm just going to tell you thank you very much for listening to this episode. You can check us out at Alt Arts Academy on all social media, at artsacademypodcast.com. Please hit us up. Let us know. Join our Facebook group, especially because every 2 weeks we have a free live class that we give out. We just taught a class on how to write a comic book. We've previously taught classes on how to make a web series. So check it out. And thanks a lot, Kazeem. You were a great guest on this first half. We're going to do the second half in just a second. You were a great guest on this first half. Deputy Headmistress, you're also great as well. For those people who are just listening to audio, she's alluded.
The greatest moment of Roxxy. You're having a serious conversation, and Roxxy is like...
But anyway, that was a wonderful episode.
Make sure to subscribe, like, comment. Thank you for watching.